The story we heard from Daniel chapter 1 is set about 605 BC, about 600 years or so before the birth of Jesus. It's at a time when the Babylonian Empire is becoming the dominant power in the region. And over the next few years, the Babylonians will take large numbers of the people of Judah prisoner and into a period of exile in Babylon. The people of God in exile wondered how they could witness to God, how they could live for God in a place and a culture which doesn't recognise or know him. Or as Psalm 137 verse 4 puts it, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? This is the question that Daniel and his friends are asking. How would their lives demonstrate they were the people of God when they didn't have the religious freedoms that they had before, when the laws and the expectations of society might be very different from the way that God had called them to live? The answer to those questions has just as much to say to us today as it did to the people at the time of Daniel. We might not have been carried into exile like some of the people of Judah, but there is a sense in which our calling to live as Christians requires us to work out how to stay true to God in a world that no longer knows or recognises him. What does it mean to live as people of faith in a faithless world? How will we sing the Lord's song? How will we tell the story of Jesus in a world that no longer speaks our language and perhaps has a very different understanding of how the world should be? How do we live as God's people in a culture in which following God makes no sense to a lot of people? It's no longer considered to be normal by most people, and it's actually quite counter-cultural very often. Throughout the book of Daniel, Daniel and his friends often find themselves in situations which conflict with their faith. In today's reading, we see that in small ways: the changing of their names, the way they're educated, even the food that they're given to eat. Later on in chapter 3, it becomes a bit more serious. They are asked to bow down and worship a statue. And when Daniel's friends Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego refuse, they're thrown into the fiery furnace. Later still, in chapter 6, they're banned from praying to anyone except the king. And this time it's Daniel who finds himself in trouble, and this time thrown to the lions for refusing to comply. As we read their stories, we see them working out what it means to live out their faith and to continue to follow God in that context. So, what do we learn from Daniel and his friends? Well, first of all, one of the things that we notice is when and where they take a stand. When they arrive in Babylon, Daniel and his friends are forced to change their names. Now, that might not seem very important, but in the Bible we know that names are very often significant. This is what their names originally mean. Daniel is the Hebrew for God is my judge. Hananiah means Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael means who is what God is. And Azariah means Yahweh has helped. The change in name is about more than just giving them nice Babylonian names which the locals would find it easier to pronounce. This is about trying to remove the reference to God. Our names are a key part of our identity, and each of these people has within their name the name of God, a reminder of who God is and a reminder of who it is in whom their identity is rooted. Their identity as people, through their names, is rooted in God. And so by changing their names, the authorities are saying in Babylon that no longer will your authority and identity be in God, but now it will be rooted in the authority and power of Babylon. But Daniel and his friends don't seem to resist that change of name. Now the next challenge for them is their education system. Daniel and his friends aren't just taken away to get a nice education. Like the change of name, this is about getting rid of their old faith, their old culture, replacing it with the Babylonian culture. Evidence from other sources outside of the biblical text tell us the kind of things that Daniel and his friends would have studied. Probably this would have included things like exorcism, astrology, the study of animal entrails, rites of purification, other various kind of spells and incantations, all things that would have been completely at odds with Daniel's Jewish faith. Interestingly, Daniel and his friends don't seem to resist the change of name, and they don't seem to resist the lessons. What they do is resist the food, and later on we see them resist bowing down to worship something that isn't God, which conflicts with their faith because God said we shouldn't bow down and worship idols, and then refusing to pray to the king and continuing to pray to God alone. They don't resist everything about this new culture. They choose when and where to make a stand. They pick their battles. They choose what is important to hold on to, what is central to their faith, and they make a stand on those issues. But other things they decide are less important, and they don't get too hung up on them. God supports them in this. The things they're learning in those lessons go against Jewish rules, so we might expect that God would be pretty unhappy about that. We might expect God would find a way to stop it, give them a kind of get out of class free pass or something like that. In fact, God does the exact opposite. He makes them top of the class. He gives Daniel the power to interpret dreams and visions and signs. He makes Daniel and his friends better than all of the others at those things, so that, we read in verse 20, they were considered 10 times better and wiser than all the other magicians and enchanters in the land. Daniel and his friends choose to stand up for their faith and choose when to let things go. And perhaps it's helpful when we think about that to ask ourselves what the reasoning is. Now, when you think about your name, you don't have much control over what other people call you. You can ask them to call you by the name you want to be known by, but you can't stop them calling you whatever they like. Similarly, you don't have much control over what other people tell you and what messages other people want to communicate with you. You can choose not to believe it, you can try not to listen to it, but you can't stop them saying it. You can't control what other people do. But you can control your own behaviour. You can control what you eat and who you worship and who you pray to. Daniel and his friends make a stand for their faith and start the resistance to the Babylonian Empire, not by challenging the behaviour of others in the first instance, but by focusing on themselves and their own behaviour, getting themselves and keeping themselves right with God. They focus on being the best followers of God that they can be and allowing that to speak to and challenge other people. Now, this might be, I think, important for us to hear as Christians today, because so often as Christians today, when there's a conflict between faith and culture, we focus on the behaviour of other people. We get really worked up about what other people are doing. We get cross that other people who are not followers of God are not living as followers of God. Now, of course, we should be concerned about sin. Of course, we should be concerned about a world in which people are turning their back on God. Of course, we should be concerned at the state of the world in that situation. And of course, we should try to challenge evil and injustice and behaviour that takes people away from living life in all its fullness. But Daniel and his friends don't start by challenging other people. They start with themselves. They start by making sure their own behaviour is consistent with their faith. They model godly living. Jesus had some words to say about this kind of thing too. He famously said that we ought to sort out the wood in our own eyes before we started doing eye surgery on other people. And this is what Daniel and his friends do. They focus first and foremost on their own behaviour and their own relationship with God, modelling a godly way to live. They show people, in other words, a different way to exist within this Babylonian culture. They are stuck in the middle of this culture, but they show people that even within that culture, there are different ways to be, different ways to live, a different world is possible. And that's how they decide to change and challenge the culture around them. Their approach is one of peaceful protest. They model a way of life that is positive, and they show the benefits of choosing to follow God. So, they resist the food that the king sends, and instead they show the benefits of living for God and of thanking God for their food. They are happier and healthier than everybody else, and that gets them noticed in a positive way. Again, they don't want to make trouble. So often as Christians, we can get drawn into challenging other people's behaviour in a way that's aggressive, in a way that's confrontational. But what does Daniel say? When the palace official who's in charge of the food comes to Daniel and says, I'm worried about what the king will do to me, I'm worried about the consequences for me, Daniel says, look, I don't want to get you in trouble. Here is a peaceful solution. Do it this way and nobody will get in trouble. Things will work out for the best. It's a way of peaceful protest. Daniel and his friends hold firm to their faith. They don't give in. They don't surrender their faith. They don't allow the big and important things to be taken away. They focus still on those and keeping them at the centre of their faith, but they think first about their own behaviour. They model an alternative and an attractive way of life. Even when they disagree something, they disagree with respect and with grace. And we see that in the life of Jesus too. You remember the occasion when Jesus is brought a woman who's been caught in adultery. Interesting always to reflect on the fact that it's only the woman who is brought before Jesus, even though both parties in that would have been equally guilty. Is the woman who's brought to Jesus, and he's asked to make a judgment about her. And Jesus doesn't diminish the impact of sin. He has a conversation with the woman afterwards in which he says to her, go and sin no more. But he doesn't start there. He starts by asking those around to examine themselves and their own consciences and their own behaviour. And if any of them are without sin, they can start off the process of judgment. Jesus gets them to focus on their own behaviour first before they worry about the behaviour of someone else. He still says to them that there'll be consequences, and he himself goes and deals with the sin of the woman. But it's handled with compassion and with respect. So, Daniel and his friends start with their own behaviour. They model a godly and attractive way of life that draws other people to be interested in what God is doing and in what following God might look like. And then another thing to notice is that they're not afraid to face the consequences. They stand firm in their faith despite the consequences, the fiery furnace and the lion's den. Now, when Daniel's friends are thrown into the fiery furnace in chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they hope that God will rescue them. But actually they're prepared to hold on to their faith even if God doesn't. They say to the king, even if our God does not rescue us, still we will not do what you ask. Still we will hold on to what we believe in. Now, it's fascinating to me to think about how and when God rescues them, and how and when God rescues Daniel. God doesn't rescue either of them beforehand. They go into the fiery furnace. Daniel goes into the lion's den. There's no last minute let off. There's no last minute rescue. They go into the difficult and dangerous situation and then are rescued from in the midst of difficulty and danger and suffering. So often in the Bible, this is what we see. That Those who follow God are not immune from difficulty and danger and suffering, but what they discover is God there in the midst of it with them. And sometimes there is rescue from those difficult and dangerous situations, but it's worth pointing out and remembering that there isn't always a rescue. This, I guess, is most clearly demonstrated for us in the life of Jesus. He prays the night before he dies in the garden, Lord, if there is any other way, if there's a chance of rescue, if there's a chance that I don't have to go through with this, then Lord, do something to prevent it. And then Jesus goes to the cross, because the way of faith is the way of the cross. The path to eternal life goes through the valley of death. Sometimes there isn't a rescue, but what we discover is that God is with us in the midst of difficulty and danger and suffering. And being people who live out our faith in a faithless world means sometimes things will be difficult. Sometimes the consequences for us of standing up for our faith might be serious. But God is there. So Daniel and his friends show us that there is a way of living out their faith. They live out their faith in a way which means they focus on their own behaviour. They focus on what's important. They protest in a peaceful and graceful and respectful way. They're not afraid to face the consequences of standing up for their faith. And we might notice then that all of this has an influence on the lives of others. So at the end of chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar the king says these words, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command. They were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." Now, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't ready to follow God at this point, but he did acknowledge God's power and presence. By the end of chapter 4, when a few more things have gone on, this is what Nebuchadnezzar says. "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just." Nebuchadnezzar, through the power and intervention of God, comes to declare for himself that God is the King of heaven. But an important step along the way was his encounter with Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and the way in which they lived out and stood up for their faith. That was an important step in moving him on in his own journey with God. And then if we look at Daniel himself, in chapter 6, when Daniel has been rescued from the lion's den, this is what the king says, and there's a new king by this time. King Darius is in place. Nebuchadnezzar has gone. Nebuchadnezzar's son has died, and now King Darius is on the throne. And this is what he writes after Daniel's rescue. "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and revere the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." Isn't that a fantastic declaration of faith from the king of Babylon? Declaring the goodness, the power and the enduring might of God, declaring that God is the God who saves. And that wonderful declaration of faith comes because of the faith of Daniel, because Daniel is prepared to go even into the lion's den in order to stand up for the faith that he believes in order to stand up for and witness to the God that he believes in and the God that he has chosen to give his life to. What does all of that mean for us today? I think there's a few things just to say in summing up. One is there's a need for us to be confident in our own faith. One of the things that helps Daniel and his friends to do what they do is that they're confident in their own faith. They trust in God. They know what they believe. They understand what the key issues are, what the things are that they need to hold on to, and what are the things that are not quite so central to their faith. And they're confident in that. There's a need for us, I think, to be equally confident in our faith today, to be informed about what we believe, to think about the kinds of things we believe. There are plenty of people today who will look to discredit or diminish the faith that we follow. There are plenty of people who will put forward arguments as to why our faith might not make sense, or why we shouldn't be Christians, or why they feel that for them God is not a reality. If we're going to engage with and discuss and influence those kind of people, we need to be confident in what we ourselves believe. We need to look at some of those arguments and understand them. And we need to think about why it is that we still hold on to our faith in the face of some of those things. When other people start to read the Bible for themselves and start to ask questions of it, we need to understand and be informed about why we hold on to the Bible. We need to take their arguments and their doubts and their struggles seriously. And we need to think about how we want to reply. We need to do our homework, do our reading, be involved in discussions with other people who don't believe the same things that we do. Talk together in our house groups and our other small groups about why we believe the things we believe. We need to practice telling our stories. That's why this year, the year of testimony, is a great opportunity for us, because there is chance for us to practice talking about the difference that God has made in our lives and why it is that we follow him, and why it is that we believe what we believe. We need to live then lives that demonstrate our faith, lives that look different from the lives of those around us. Lives that are attractive. That was one of the key features of Daniel and his friends. They lived lives that were attractive. They were fitter and happier and better fed than others around them. So people could see there was something to emulate. They were wiser in their decisions and in interpreting the dreams and visions of others than anyone else around them. So again, there was something attractive for people to emulate. We too need to model something attractive in the way that we live our lives. Jesus said he came to give his followers life in all its fullness, and we need to let that be evident within us. And then, most importantly perhaps, we need in all this to trust in God. For it was through trust in God that Daniel and his friends were able to go into the pit of fire, or into the pit of lions, or just to exist in the pit of difficulty and despair and suffering that human beings sometimes find themselves in. It was because they knew in those places that God was with them that they were able to live out their faith and to hold on to it even in the face of personal suffering and danger. Lots there for us to think about. So now let's pray together.